Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see so many of you here. My name's Nathan Filer. I'm a reader in creative writing here at Bath University, and I am also co-lead with my colleague Samantha Walton, who is also here, co-lead of the Research Centre for Mental Health, Wellbeing and Creativity. And we are co-hosting this morning's Brain and Behaviour Seminar with the Psychology Centre for Health and Cognition. And our speaker this morning is Professor Thomas Dixon. Thomas is a Professor of History at Queen Mary University of London, and Thomas specialises in the history of emotion. He was the founding director of the Centre for the History of Emotions and is currently PI for a Wellcome Trust funded project, the Living with Feeling project. I'm just going to pop in the chat for you all this link where you can find a full biography of Thomas and I think maybe his Twitter contact details or some such as well, if you want to be in touch with him. I first met Thomas last year when he kindly agreed to be interviewed for an episode of a podcast series that I was making called Why Do I Feel?, which explores emotions through stories and expert testimony. And I interviewed Thomas for an episode on the many faces of anger. I will also, a little bit of shameless self-promotion, drop a link to that podcast series also in the chat. So that's the whole series. The episode which Thomas contributed to is called The Many Faces of Anger. And we had, I think, a brilliant conversation, a very far-ranging conversation. We talked about Thomas's view and the view of many other scholars of emotion, that our emotions are ostensibly, he told me, performative acts, that they're social and that they are learned as opposed to innate. We talked about how we are living through what Thomas described as an impoverishment of our emotional language, which perhaps we will touch upon again later. And Thomas also argued to me that, to quote him, he said, "We can be confident that the ancient Greeks and Romans did not experience the modern emotion of anger," which became part of the debate of the episode. We didn't fall out too much, did we, Thomas? We managed to
no one lost their temper. It was quite civilized.
No one lost their temper in a way that the ancient Greeks and Romans would recognize that.
Certainly not that way, or one of us would be dead at this point.
Well, exactly. Yeah, we'd move into ire and revenge and so on. So we remained on good terms, and I'm delighted to welcome Thomas now to speak to us. So I will hand over to you now, Thomas Dixon.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you so much to Samantha and Nathan and Kate for hosting and inviting me here. I'm very honoured to come and speak to your group. I've got one apology to make quickly, is that you can hear maybe I've got a very croaky voice. I hope that won't interfere too much. I may stop and take a gulp of water every so often, so excuse me if I do that. I don't have COVID. I have a cold and a sore throat, but I'm fine. Let me now see if I can share the correct screen, and that'll get us going. At that point, I know from experience on Google Meet, I won't be able to see anything apart from my PowerPoint slides. So I'll need you to be assertive and tell me if you can't see me or can't hear me, or that I've spoken for too long, or that you're terribly bored and you wish I would hurry up, or anything at all. You'll just have to shout it at me. I'll leave that to Nathan to do. So let me find my PowerPoint and then we'll be off. That's now, my PowerPoint's now vanished. That's interesting.
This is all part of the show, isn't it? It's very meta. It's how we lead into what anger looks like.
Yeah, and anxiety.
Yeah.
It is rather strange. I've still got the PowerPoint open on my computer, and when I tried it earlier, it was just right there, and now it's not. But let me try something else then. I'll try sharing my entire screen.
So it should be.
Yep, I'm now sharing. Okay. Has that worked?
Ooh, yes, it looks like it's just popping
Okay,
up.
and I'm now going to go into PowerPoint. So I'll need some audio reassurance, Nathan, if I'm showing you the right thing.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. So far you are. We've got your title screen there.
We're off. Okay, so I now enter the talk and the PowerPoint. Brilliant. So I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes. I'm going to talk a bit about what is the history of emotions, probably for about 20 minutes, talking in general terms and about 3 short examples of my own work, which I'm most sort of able to talk about. Then the second half will be the bit about lessons for psychologists and school children. Now, it's obviously a very presumptuous title to think that I can teach lessons to psychologists, let alone school children, about emotions. But that was just to get your attention, really, that title. And I'll talk a bit about the relationship between the history of emotions and its applications in the present day. So first of all, what is the history of emotions? And all of you will probably have some idea of what it is, some of you more than others, but I'll give you an overview and assume no prior knowledge. As you would expect, this is an approach to the past which focuses on emotions and what people felt in the past. And we historians of emotions tend to trace our origins back to several places, but especially this French historian Lucien Febvre, who wrote a very important article in 1941 called Sensibility and History, How to Reconstitute the Affective Life of the Past. So that's kind of one foundation moment. And Lucien Febvre issued a rallying call to other historians to go hunting for emotions and their expression in this lovely wide range of sources in the past: conduct books, paintings, music, and novels. And there's a phrase I like of his. He says we should plunge into the darkness. Feel what I've just done now with sharing my screen, where psychology wrestles with history. So I guess that's what we're having this morning, a wrestling match between psychology and history. And he said what surprises we might look forward to. Then nothing much happened for about 40 years in terms of the history of emotions as a field. And then we saw the beginnings of what has now become a really burgeoning and quite major subfield within history. I won't read out everything on this slide. If people want me to share their slides with them afterwards, do drop me an email. There's some work by Peter Stearns and Carol Stearns in the 1980s, William Reddy and Barbara Rosenwein starting about 20 years ago. And then the real sort of massive explosion of history of emotions started about 15 years ago. And there was founding of centres here at Queen Mary, also in Berlin, also in Australia. And in 2017, we got our own journal as a field: Emotions, History, Culture, Society. So it's been a really exponential increase in the field in recent years. There's a lot of influential work in the field, but I'm going to highlight this article, which last time I looked on Google Scholar has been cited about 12 or 1300 times. Monique Shear, Are Emotions a Kind of Practice, and Is That What Makes Them Have a History? A Bourdieuian approach to understanding emotion. If you want to go to one place to find a sort of influential position statement about what historians of emotions think about emotions, this is a great place to go. And this slide shows a couple of the centres that I mentioned and a couple of introductory books on the field, one by Jan Plamper and one by Rob Bodis. Okay, that's the field in general in about 3 minutes flat. And now I'm going to talk about my own work for a few minutes. My way into this fascinating field was through my PhD, which was in fact a PhD in divinity and Faculty of Divinity in Cambridge, which became the book you see on the left, From Passions to Emotions, the Creation of a Secular Psychological Category. And the good news is that there is a 5-page open access article from 2012, pictured on the right, which summarizes the argument of that book in a succinct manner. And what is the argument? Well, it can be summarized in a very simple way with this diagram, which is essentially the emotions didn't exist till around 1820. And prior to that, there were other psychological categories and philosophical and religious categories which resembled our category of emotions, but were not the same. And the ones I've put there, but which is not at all exhaustive, are appetites, passions, and affections. Appetites are things like lust, as well as hunger and thirst. Passions, troubling passions, they tend to be sort of morally worrying states like jealousy or rage. And then the affections are the gentler feelings of love, joy, and affection itself. And my sort of big idea that I've been going on about since 2003 or so is that, then the emotions come along, this big, baggy psychological category, and that has caused us a lot of trouble for various reasons. And I pinpoint one individual who I feel very fond of, Dr. Thomas Brown of the University of Edinburgh, who was professor of moral philosophy and gave some very influential lectures on the philosophy of the human mind. I've pinpointed him as what I call the inventor of the emotions. It wasn't a cut and dried thing. He didn't say, I've got this new term, the emotions, you should all use it now. It was more gradual than that, but I've identified his lectures as the sort of definitive turning point, which really changed the mindset and the vocabulary in the emerging discipline of psychology later in the 19th century. Now, again, sticking with this rather big and schematic picture, what is the problem, if there is one, with thinking that passions are the same as emotions? And again, I've been going on for ages about the fact that they are not the same thing, and I'm going to try and illustrate why the passions are not the emotions. In fact, just on a radio program just yesterday, I heard a scholar saying, the passions, in other words, the emotions, as if that was just a simple translation, which is very wrong. Okay, so this is a 17th century text called The Use of the Passions by a French moral philosopher called Senot, a Catholic philosopher. And it was translated into English in 1649. And here is the wonderful and beautiful frontispiece of that book. And we see here the passions all chained together: joy, fear, despair. There's some nice, unusual ones as well. Boldness. Is eschewing on there somewhere? Yes, eschewing is there as well. So we see them sort of personified and chained together. At the bottom, we have a little Cupid-like figure of love. At the top, we have reason sitting on her throne. And then above reason, we have divine grace sort of whispering in her ear, wisdom and I guess sort of theological knowledge. And then at the bottom, we have a little poem about passions being arraigned by reason and reason being advised by divine grace. And what people might tend to do, even historians of emotion, is to sort of gradually cut away the bits of that image. So get rid of that weird poem about theology and reason. Get rid of that image of the reason on a throne and divine grace in a cloud, which is weird. And then we've got something that looks a bit more like the emotions. And then we might zoom in and go, there we go. There's a couple of emotions. And so my message is, this is not an emotion, for a lot of reasons, which we can talk about maybe in the Q&A. But I'll mention maybe just two. One is, this is a through and through a morally and religiously engaged category. I'll go back to the bigger picture. The passions are chained together, symbolizing our enslavement to the passions. The connection with reason and love is absolutely fundamental. And the way that you experience these passions is very often as sins. These are sinful, monstrous things. And as you are experiencing them, you are feeling that, their sinfulness and their monstrousness. And you are feeling the inner fight between reason and sin. And you're feeling the fact that you're a fallen human creature. So I don't want to go on more about that, but that's one reason. There is another reason, which is that they don't look the same, and I'll come back to that. But the way they're expressed and the way they're visualized are very different as well. Okay, that's from passions to emotions. The second bit of work of mine that I want to talk about is this book, Weeping Britannia, another example of how you come at the emotions, which is quite different. And this is coming through tears and coming through bodily expression. And I've got on the right there a quote from a William Blake poem, which I come back to a couple of times in this book, Weeping Britannia, which is a history of tears in Britain since the Middle Ages. And the line that I like there is, for a tear is an intellectual thing, and a sigh is the sword of an angel king. That quote, a tear is an intellectual thing, is the title of a very good book about the philosophy of emotions by Jerome Noy. But it's also a sort of motto that I think is really helpful, because it gets this basic idea of emotional feelings and expressions being cognitive. And as psychologists, you'll all be very familiar with the cognitive approach to emotions that sees them as judgments, beliefs about the world. And so to say a tear is an intellectual thing, I like the idea that a tear is like a thought in liquid form running down your cheek. And in terms of the sort of historical details I get into in this book, that I've already said it's quite wide-ranging from the Middle Ages onwards, and it starts here with Marjorie Kemp. Mother, miller, brewer, and mystic, Marjorie Kemp was an extreme weeper. It's the first sentence of the book, and her life story is incredible. And I think it's fair to say that she is the all-time champion historical weeper. You know, she's crying almost all the time. She cries for joy. She cries over beautiful dreams and visions that she has. She cries over her own sinfulness. She cries over the sinfulness of everybody else. She is rebuked for her tears by many of her fellow pilgrims and fellow religious. She's clearly immensely irritating. She's forever weeping and wailing, telling people that they're terrible sinners. And she's terrific. And her book is the oldest surviving autobiography in English, I believe. The book of Marjorie Kemp. And so she's a brilliant and colourful place to start. And obviously with her, I can look at, as this image suggests, you know, the religious significance of weeping in particular, the tears of Mary, the mother of Jesus here, and the tears of Jesus himself, and the tears of others in the Christian story are very important and central to the sort of emotional regime of the Middle Ages in Europe. So there's a lot to be said there. And again, we can talk in questions if people want to more about the significance of tears in Christianity, which is very, very large, unusually large. Christianity is an unusually emotional religion, I think it's fair to say, as a massive generalization. Moving into the 18th and 19th century, just to give you a flavor of some other bits of the history of emotions that I look at in Weeping Britannia. There is a fashion for tears and sentimentality in the 18th century across Europe and Britain. And one of the things people did in the 18th century, which they've done ever since, of course, as well, is to read and weep over novels. I mean, now we have, you know, movies and reality television, all sorts of other ways to get our tears flowing as well. But in the 18th century, if you're an educated lady or gentleman, you might well be weeping over a sentimental novel, such as this one, The Man of Feeling, which was published in the 1770s and is an incredibly lachrymose text. The central character is a man called Harley, who goes around encountering unfortunate people, maimed and injured soldiers, beggars, prostitutes, and he always sheds a tear, and sometimes quite a lot of tears, over their plight. And it's a sentimental novel, and it's one which is putting forward a particular philosophy about the importance of sympathy and the importance of human feeling, which was central to a lot of movements, both political and cultural, in the 18th century. I thought I'd include this example of a politician who was a man of feeling around the same time. This is Charles James Fox, and this is a cartoon of him shedding big globules of tears in Parliament when he had a row with Edmund Burke about the French Revolution in the 1790s. And I include this just because there's been quite a lot of parliamentary emotion in recent weeks in our own time. And here is a politician sobbing. I mean, I don't think we're likely to see many tears falling from the eyes of our current Prime Minister over anything that he's done wrong. But this was a very emotional age, and Charles Fox and others wept in Parliament while having disagreements with their colleagues. This text by Charles Darwin brings us, is an important text I come back to a lot, and it brings us into several themes I want to talk about in the rest of this talk, including the relationship between psychology and other ways of thinking about emotions. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals by Charles Darwin was published in 1872, and it is a foundational text in the psychology of emotions. And again, it's something we could talk about as a relationship between Darwin's ideas on emotions and more modern theories about basic emotions. But just for the moment, I want to talk about Darwin and tears, because it was actually these three words in Darwin's book that first got me started on my research into the history of tears that resulted in my book. He says that English men rarely cry. And he goes on, except under the pressure of the acutest grief, whereas in some parts of the continent, the men shed tears much more readily and freely. Now, obviously, this is a statement in a scientific book about the science of emotions, and yet also it's blatantly, you know, a cultural stereotype which Darwin is asserting, which is part of a sexist, racist, imperialist view of the world, which becomes the sort of late Victorian and early 20th century ethos of the British stiff upper lip. It was interesting to see Darwin there in the worlds of both culture and science, asserting that English men rarely cry. And I say much, much more about that in the book, and we can talk about it if people like. So now rushing on to the third and final example of my own research into the history of emotions to give a flavour of what it is. And this is the work that Nathan's already kindly mentioned, and which drew his interest and that he and I debated on his on his podcast, where I make these, I think to him, somewhat outlandish claims about ancient people didn't experience modern anger. I think to make the claim as plausible as possible, you need to put quite a lot of emphasis on the word modern there. I'm saying that there are these strong passions of rage and revenge and ire that are the ancestors of modern anger. So they're not entirely unrelated, but they are different. And so this article is called "What is the History of Anger? A History of?" And I go in some detail into the sort of ancient and modern ideas about anger and related terms. And I cite in the introduction to this article Nathan Filer, because I was really inspired by the way that Nathan writes in his book about schizophrenia. And at the very beginning of the book, he writes about the difficulties involved in using any language about mental health. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with his book and what he says, and that there are no sort of non-controversial terms and concepts, which is absolutely right. And he says, it's not that difficult. You can, if you want to write about schizophrenia while keeping your distance from the concept of schizophrenia, you can do it. And all the way through the book, he calls it so-called schizophrenia, or he puts it in quotation marks. And I was inspired by this to think, yeah, I can write about the history of anger without buying into a belief in the existence of a thing called anger. And so that is what I did at some length in that article. And I also have my own podcast all about anger, which you can go listen to, which came out a couple of years ago, where I interviewed psychologists and historians and really tried to get into what anger was, is, and should be, and includes 2 dramas as well by Craig Baxter, which are brilliant. One inspired by Seneca, called Seneca Annoyed, and one called Darwin Vexed. And they're very funny, but also quite profound reflections on the history of ideas about rage and anger. So I've already alluded slightly to the visual aspects of the history of emotions, and I'm going to come back to the visual aspects. But I thought just in this final 2 minutes about what is the history of emotions, I'd put a little bit of emphasis on language, because I already have when I talk about emotions. But for me, the history of words and terminology is fundamental. And I think I'm at the extreme end of history of emotions, historians of emotions, and how much emphasis I want to put on words. So one of the things I did in researching the history of so-called anger was to look, in other cultures and in other periods, what language was there. And unsurprisingly, there's many, many different words in Greek and in Latin, which mean things a bit like, but a bit different from rage, anger, revenge, and so on. And I've put some of them up there and recommend this book by William Harris if you want to go into that. I've also consulted and enjoyed works by Anna Wiersbecker, the linguist, who's written quite a lot about this. I love the title of her book, Imprisoned in English, The Hazards of English as a Default Language, which just in the title gets at what I think is the main problem with thinking that a modern English psychological word like emotion has captured something essential and universal in human nature, which is an implausible starting point, even before you start getting deeper into the history or indeed the philosophy of emotion. And this is a nice visual illustration of the point that Nathan alluded to in his introduction about the impoverishment of language for anger-like states. This is a Google Ngram viewer graph showing the usage of a range of anger-related words from the 18th century to the present. And what it shows, as you can see, is that of those 5 words I've picked out to look at, and this is from a large corpus of books that are held on Google Books, in the 18th century up until the middle of the 19th century, we have a period where anger is one of the least frequently used, and resentment and rage are much more commonly used. Then we have this turning point around 1820, which is quite convenient for me, just when I say the modern emotions are sort of invented. And then gradually anger through the 19th century takes over as the dominant term. And then from around 1960 and 70, the Paul Ekman basic emotions era onwards, anger just zooms up to really outperform all the other words. And so you do have a suggestion there of this impoverishment of our emotional vocabularies to we're down to these sort of basic emotions, which rather sort of obliterate important and rich distinctions of language and feeling. Right, so just to finish off this section, what is the history of emotions? You may wonder why, as indeed I always do when the slide comes up, why is there a slide with a picture of the Wizard of Oz 1939 on it? And it's simply because I like to think of the history of emotions as being an approach to the past. So before we get onto the implications for the present, an approach to the past, which is a bit like the experience, if you've ever seen it, of watching the original 1939 Wizard of Oz, where it starts off in black and white, and then in the early moments of the film, as Dorothy arrives in the land of Oz, it transforms into glorious technicolor. And so one of the things that History of Emotions does is to put the pulse and the color and the feeling back into history in a rich and embodied way. But the other things that it does is what I want to talk about, I suppose, for the rest of this talk, which is that by getting into the genealogy of our emotions and pulling them apart a bit to see how they're made up, we can liberate ourselves to some extent from, as I put it here, the grip of modern psychological and psychiatric categories. It's a sort of process of historical disenchantment. We can join in interdisciplinary conversations about theories of emotion, which is what I hope I'm doing with you this morning, and we can continue conversations about sameness and difference, continuity and change, and that's what I'm going to emphasize in the second half of this talk, is that question about sameness and difference and emotion. I'll explain what I mean in a second. To find out more about the history of emotions, the best book on the field as a whole is not yet available, but I finished writing it a few weeks ago and it'll be published next year. There are other introductions to the history of emotions available, including ones I've already mentioned by Rob Bodis in particular, which are very, very good. Okay, so why would any of this matter for psychologists is my next question. And I'm going to start by going back to our friend Lucien Febvre, who I've already introduced to you, because he says some quite extreme and quite negative things about psychology in the 1930s. He said the science of contemporary psychologists can have no possible application to the past, and that psychological anachronism is the worst sort of anachronism and the most insidious and harmful of all. So what did he mean by that, and why would he say that? Well, first of all, he pointed out that the people lived very differently in the past, and as a result, they felt very differently in the past. And he pointed out that the scientific study of the feelings and experiences of affluent Western white people in the 20th century could hardly be expected to provide insights into the mental lives of earlier and very different periods. In the past, people's lives were often dominated by the changing seasons, by the threat of disease and famine. They lived in a world not yet tamed by science and medicine, and in which life and property hung by a thread in a way that is hard for a modern person to imagine. This, by the way, is a paragraph from my book that I'm just reading out here. I won't read all of it out, but we can also think about the prevalence of disease, of violence, of religious belief, the huge transformation of modern emotional experience by technology, communications technology, travel technology, and as I conclude, it felt different to live in the world before these extraordinary technologies of control existed. So this is quite a strong statement by Febvre, which I'm supporting, that people felt differently in the past because they lived differently in the past. And if we are serious, as I am, about thinking of emotions as first and foremost social experiences, then the way that you live and the way that you live with others is fundamental to what emotions you can feel. So there's an issue of sameness and difference between how we live now and how people lived in the past. But there's also an issue which is of fundamental importance to psychology of all kinds, which is individual difference. So difference is the keynote for historians. I'm also suggesting, and I expect to some extent will be preaching to the converted, it should be very important to psychologists as well. Now, I'm just going to here give a rather familiar caricature of the Universalist view of emotions. What we see here is Paul Ekman and the Pixar movie Inside Out. Ekman was one of the people who was consulted for that movie. And this is a slightly unfair but helpful caricature of the Ekman basic emotions view, that there's a small number of basic emotions. We all have them. Everyone has always had them. If you're a human being, you've got these basic emotions. Now, the number of basic emotions differs, as you will know, from theorist to theorist. Sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 6 or 7. I think I've seen it as low as 3 or 4. But also Ekman in his later work has what seems to me this extravagant list of 16 or 17 basic emotions, including things that look to me so obviously culturally specific that it's quite extraordinary. But there we go. That's the basic emotions theory. It comes in many forms, but it basically says we all have the same emotions. And I guess if you're a defender of the basic emotions theory, you would look at the historical and cultural differences that I'm talking about, and you would say, yeah, sure, but those are superficial. underneath there's these 5 guys here, or some version of them, that there's some basic emotions. And I'll come back now to anger, because anger is one of the most basic emotions. It's on pretty much every list of suggested basic emotions, whether 5, 6, 7, or 16. And it illustrates some of what I think are the harmful tendencies of universalizing theories of emotion. This is an article from 2016. There were a lot of articles like this in relation to Brexit and in relation to Trump, explaining hugely complex political and social change with reference to a basic emotion that everybody has, anger. And within a few days of the unspeakable one being elected president of the United States, there were several different articles explaining that in terms of anger and rage. And I picked out 2 here, which I rather like, because they are coming from very different psychological perspectives. The one on the left is about the neuroscience of rage, and the one on the right, which I'll come back to, is Lisa Feldman Barrett on the varieties of anger. And if you even just look at the artwork on those articles, one is the classic sort of brain scan with bits lit up, and the other is this rather weird abstract art, which is more suggestive of difference. The neuroscience article, which is from the Scientific American blog, explains the election result in terms of the limbic system provoking rage and violent aggression to maintain social order, protect our own tribe, and slaughter another tribe if necessary for our self-preservation. And that this neural circuitry of defensive aggression and rage to protect one's own interests and slaughter others is what explains Trump's victory. The article doesn't explain why, approximately half or a bit less of people were driven by this limbic system, and the other half or a bit more were not. Well, I won't rant on about what's wrong with that. We can talk about what's right and wrong about that approach, but it seems to me extraordinarily sweeping and extraordinarily unconvincing. But there are other approaches to anger and rage within psychology, which are much more in tune, I suppose, with the kind of history of emotions approach that I'm advocating, which emphasizes difference and change. And I've put this article up here, Anger and Its Cousins, by Michelli and Castelfranchi, just as one example of a more nuanced approach coming out of a different part of psychology of emotion. And probably the most widely cited example of a more constructionist, difference-oriented approach is associated with Lisa Feldman Barrett. She and Jim Russell have been the leading advocates of this core affect theory, in which emotions are made by a process of psychological construction, in which language, culture, and belief and experience are fundamental, and if you like, the underlying mechanism, the underlying hardware is thought of in terms of core affect, which varies on these different dimensions. And if you're not familiar with that and you'd like me to talk about it more afterwards, I'm very happy to. So history can support this sort of more constructionist and more difference-oriented approach to emotions. This is a scientific article from a few years ago challenging the facial universality of certain emotions. So central to the Paul Ekman Basic Emotions Project is the idea that every basic emotion has the same facial expression. So if scientists, as they have done here, can show that there are cultures where the supposed universal facial expression for anger in fact represents fear, or vice versa, then that helps to undermine one part of the basic emotions theory, and history can be used to do the same thing. The facial expression for anger-like emotions has changed over time. And again, that's something I could talk more about. There's also, to come back to a point I made much earlier, a bigger scale historical change of going from, on the left, 7 deadly sins, to on the right, 5 basic emotions. This is a whole different moral and emotional universe that is being inhabited and experienced. I'm going to end this section with 2 quotations about difference. The first is from Dr. Thomas Cogan, author of a philosophical treatise on the passions in 1800. And he's an English physician and writer. And I'll just read this out to you. He's talking about travel and the differences in different cultures when you travel. He says, but the diversities of opinions and manners, with their correspondent predilections and aversions, exceed enumeration. It is these diversities which furnish the amusement derived from the perusal of travels. And as no two nations on the globe correspond in every instance, the peculiarities of each illustrate in a striking manner the truth of our observation. They indicate the inconceivable variety of sentiments and affections which incidentally take place among beings of the same species, inhabitants of the same sublunary system, conversant with similar objects and possessing similar powers of mind. And I almost cried when I found that quotation because it expressed to me so brilliantly what I've been trying to say. If you're wondering about sublunary system, I'm sure you recognize what that means. It means sort of underneath the moon. Now, a much shorter version of the same sentiment. And this is from a classroom visit that I did some years ago. And a girl in the class, having had a lesson with me about emotions, and I was going around asking people's opinions, and she said, I think that we should feel differently, and held up this rather wonderfully differently spelled version of her ethos of difference. So I was exceedingly pleased to have that that message coming back from the classroom, which brings me on to, for the last 8 minutes, what might a historian of emotions do to help in the classroom in schools? And this arises from work that I've been doing with an academy chain called TCAT in the southeast of England since about 2019. It was somewhat disrupted by lockdown, but it gave us the opportunity to redesign the lessons while the schools were closed and then have another go. It's a project called Developing Emotions, and the basic idea is to use history, but also other arts and humanities subjects to promote emotional literacy. For those of you who know about the way these subjects are covered in schools, both primary and secondary, it tends to be through a subject called PSHE, Personal, Social, Health and Economic Education. And the lessons tend to be fine, but a bit boring, and to follow quite a simple formula about, these are your feelings. You might have big feelings or little feelings. And then when you get into secondary school, you'll get a lot more emphasis on mental health and mental illness. And you'll start telling teenagers about why they might be suffering from anxiety and depression and so forth. So I wanted to contribute some more interesting, more historically rich lessons about emotions that schools could use. And that is what these are. So Developing Emotions is a series of 16 lessons that can be used in primary schools that are aimed at year 5 or year 6, drawing on quite a wide range of resources. And I'm going to give you a quick flavor of those lessons so you know what I'm talking about. So on the left, you can see the activity book, which the children get if they take part in these lessons. And on the right, there's just one page where one child has done some angry art for us, showing a volcano, and also some vocabulary, again, with some different spellings: livid, apoplectic, and vengeful. I like that image on the right because that summarizes quite well two of the main things I want to do, which is to give children a richer vocabulary and to give children a richer visual vocabulary of imagery that they might use. And we do that through the history of art, music, and all sorts of other things. So, for example, in the week on feeling blue, in the first lesson, the children learn how to write a blues song, and they write and perform a blues song. They learn a tiny bit about the history of blues music. In that same week, they also learn about black as a color of misery and depression. The black dog, the phrase that Churchill famously used, but more importantly, black bile and melancholy as one of the 4 humours in the historic Galenic understanding of the 4 humours that move the human body. And they have a little quiz they can take at the end to find out which of the 4 humours they are. Are they melancholic or sanguine or phlegmatic or choleric? We also have a quick look in the lessons at Charles Darwin. These slides are actually from the PowerPoints for the lessons themselves. So this is what the year 5 children would be seeing. And in the case of Darwin, we use that to think about whether other animals have emotions that are like humans, and whether, for example, with these smiley looking animals, are they feeling happy? Probably not. They might be feeling something else like aggression or fear or nothing much at all. So again, we're using the sort of historical images to get into psychological and emotional debates. Pleasingly, the lessons work in the simple sense of they do manage to teach children a much richer vocabulary, for example. And this little graph just shows the near doubling of the emotional vocabularies of the Year 5 children that took these lessons. And then in the current academic year, I've been trying to visit all the TCAT primary schools, of which there are 29, and doing lessons again with children, not the lessons that I've just been showing you, but some more general ones about what emotions are. And one thing I asked them to do is to say, imagine that I'm an alien, and I won't do for you my alien impression that I do for them. And I don't know what emotions are. I've never heard of them. You've got to explain to me what an emotion is. And they tend, and then I give them a few minutes with their whiteboards to write down what they would tell an alien an emotion was. A lot of them tend to stick at the level of an emotion is a feeling, which as an alien, I explained to them, I don't find very helpful because I don't know what a feeling is either. And then they will get into your body changes in certain ways. You might express yourself, your bodily in certain ways. You might feel strange in your stomach or in your hands. And there's one at the bottom right, which I put up here, which I particularly like. An emotion is how we feel, and they are how we express ourselves. It also shows your opinion on something, which I thought was fantastic, because this was a sort of 9-year-old coming up with the cognitive theory of emotions, that emotions are your opinions about something. Or to go back to the William Blake quote, a tear is an intellectual thing. So I gave particular praise to that child who had invented the cognitive theory of emotion. Finally, and this is, I have to say, my absolute favorite part of the visits that I'm doing at the moment, is I invite the Year 5 children to choose an emotion, not tell anybody which emotion they're thinking of, any feeling. It could be something simple or something complicated, and then to use just shape and color to draw that emotion. And then at the end of that part of the lesson, I then hold a few of them up and we all discuss them and try and guess what feeling it is trying to show. And I've just got some examples here of some of the artwork that children have come up with. Really quite stunning, some of it, I think. And walking around the class and seeing them coming up with these, it's sometimes quite worrying, actually, but also quite moving to see them and the energy and enthusiasm with which they engage with this task. This, I think, was the one that most astonished me when I saw it. Is someone, again, it's a 9-year-old girl drew this, of a mask, a smiling mask that's been taken off. I mean, this is clearly someone who has reflected, I guess, on emotions and mental health themselves, with quite amazing image. She drew that in about 10 minutes when I asked them to do this exercise. So if you would like to find out more about what we are doing with schools, then there's some links on there, and do please just email me if you're interested and would like to know more. And there's some more websites and Twitter accounts and things there. And I'm going to stop sharing so that I can hopefully see and hear people again.
Oh, well, Thomas, thank you so much. That was just such a fascinating talk. We are now going to move into the Q&A part of this session. As I said before, I think traditionally we stop recording at this point, so I will stop. So I will do that now. But you can see lots of thank yous coming in there on the in the chat room. But I will stop recording. Thank you very much indeed, Thomas Dixon.
I assume you could all see and hear me throughout. You would have said if you couldn't, I hope.